Have you ever heard a story so ancient, so powerful, so astonishingly relevant that it shakes you to your core because you realize it's not just about the past, it's about you? What if I told you there was a woman, thousands of years ago, who defied everything, gender norms, social roles, tribal politics, and even the brutal expectations of war, and came out not just victorious, but revered? Stay with me because this is not the Sunday school version you heard as a kid. This is the untold story of Deborah, the warrior judge of Israel, a woman whose life was so bold, so fierce, so filled with divine power that it threatened the status quo of an entire nation. And yet, history barely whispers her name. You clicked this video because something inside you stirred. Maybe you're searching for a story of strength in dark times, a forgotten hero, or maybe you're just tired of the same recycled characters and you're hungry for truth, raw, real, human truth. You're in the right place. Because by the end of this video, you're going to get what you came for. You're going to walk away with the full picture of a woman history tried to reduce to a few verses, a name on a dusty scroll. But here, she's about to rise. Deborah's story isn't just ancient history, it's a map, a mirror, a prophecy. And I promise, you've never heard it like this before. Now, I want you to breathe for a second. Center yourself. Because we're about to dive into something deeper than just a historical retelling. This is a psychological journey. I want you to not just hear Deborah's story. I want you to feel it. I want you to put yourself in her shoes, to ask yourself, what would I do if I were her? Could I carry the weight she carried? Could I lead men into battle when every voice around me said, stay silent, stay small? As you listen, I challenge you to reflect, not just on who she was, but on who you are becoming. Let's get real. YouTube is full of sensational thumbnails, clickbait titles, and shallow content that leaves you empty after 3 minutes. But this isn't one of those videos. This is your invitation to sit down and truly experience something sacred. Something empowering. Something that may just shift the way you see yourself, especially if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told that your strength was too much. Deborah didn't just survive in a world built for men. She conquered it. She was a prophet, a judge, and a military leader at a time when women weren't even allowed to speak in public. Imagine the courage that took. Imagine the fire she must have carried in her soul. But this isn't just about a powerful woman. This is about a nation on the brink of collapse. A people lost in corruption, suffering under the weight of their own decisions, crying out for rescue. It's about a leader emerging from the shadows at just the right time, when hope seemed impossible, when the enemy looked too strong, when everyone expected defeat. And what did God do? He didn't send a king. He didn't raise up a mighty warrior. He chose a woman. Let that sink in. He chose a woman named Deborah, sitting under a palm tree, to bring justice and victory to his people. And that, my friends, is where everything begins. But before we meet Deborah, let's set the stage. The land of Israel was in chaos. This was the time of the judges, before kings, before David, before Solomon. The people were trapped in a cycle of rebellion and regret. They'd turn away from God, fall under oppression, cry out in desperation, and then a deliverer would rise. But this time, things were worse than ever. The Canaanites, led by a cruel general named Sisera, had iron chariots, cutting-edge military tech of the day. The Israelites had nothing. They were oppressed, broken, afraid. No leader dared to rise. The men were silent. The warriors were hiding. And that's when Deborah appears. And who was she? Not a queen. Not a soldier. She wasn't even from a powerful tribe. She was a wife. A mother. A woman sitting beneath a palm tree between Ramah and Bethel, offering wisdom, delivering judgment, and quietly earning the trust of a broken people. She didn't scream for power. She didn't campaign. She simply listened, spoke truth, and led with conviction. And the people, desperate and confused, came to her. Can you imagine the weight of that? A nation turning to a woman for leadership in a time when women had no official role, no vote, no voice. Deborah didn't just break the mold. She burned it to the ground. You might be wondering right now, how did she do it? How did she become the judge, the prophet, the the one chosen to confront a brutal enemy army. What made her rise above everyone else? And here's the twist that most people miss. It wasn't just about courage or leadership or even faith. It was about obedience. Radical, risky, countercultural obedience. Deborah heard the voice of God in a time when everyone else was tuned out. She believed what others had forgotten. She saw what others refused to see. And when she spoke, her words carried fire. She called a man named Barak to lead an army, and when he hesitated, she didn't flinch. She looked him in the eye and said, "If you won't go without me, fine, I'll go. But the honor will not be yours. A woman will get the credit." Do you feel the power of that moment? She wasn't seeking glory. She was speaking prophecy. And yet, even now, there's a tension, a mystery. Because Deborah's story is filled with contradictions that make her both relatable and unreachable. She was gentle, yet fierce. Humble, yet unshakable. She didn't hold a sword, but her voice carried the weight of 1,000. She didn't lead like a king, she led like a mother. And maybe that's why she was so effective. Because she didn't just fight battles, she restored dignity. She didn't just win a war, she gave people hope again. But the real twist, the part almost nobody talks about, is what happened after the battle. Because, yes, Deborah led her people to victory. Yes, the enemy fell. Yes, the impossible became reality. But what comes next is darker, more complex, more human. And if you want the full truth, if you want to understand what made Deborah's leadership so rare, so radical, you have to stay with me. Because this story is about to take a turn that no one sees coming. You might think you know what happens next. You might think this is just another victory story. Hero rises, evil falls, everyone cheers. But it's not that simple. Deborah wasn't just fighting an enemy out there. She was battling something deeper. Something within her people. Something within herself. And as we journey deeper into her story, you're going to see the cost of leadership, the price of purpose, and the burden of being chosen. Because being called by God doesn't just mean power, it means pressure. It means loneliness. It means standing alone when no one else will. So here's my promise to you. If you stay until the end of this video, you're not just going to know Deborah. You're going to understand her. You're going to see her not as a character in a book, but as a living, breathing woman who carried the fate of a nation on her shoulders. And you're going to see yourself in her, in ways that will challenge, inspire, and maybe even heal parts of you that you didn't know were broken. You're going to walk away changed. But first, we need to go back to the beginning. Before the prophecy, before the battle, before the fame, back to the quiet place under the palm tree, back to the moment everything started to shift. What happened there wasn't just political. It wasn't even just spiritual. It was personal, deeply personal. And what Deborah saw in that moment would change the course of history forever. But what did she see? That is what we uncover next. Deborah sat beneath that palm tree day after day, her hands folded gently in her lap, her eyes scanning the horizon not just for signs of travelers, but for something deeper, something divine. The people came to her like moths to a flame, not because she claimed to be special, not because she demanded attention, but because when she spoke, something inside them stirred. They didn't always understand it, but they felt it. There was a steadiness in her presence, a certainty that pierced through the confusion of their lives. They would walk for miles, dusty feet carrying stories of betrayal, injustice, desperation, and somehow, she always knew exactly what to say. She wasn't just passing down verdicts like some ancient judge in robes. She was reading people's hearts, speaking truths they had buried, exposing secrets they thought were safe. And this strange power, this sacred insight, made her both revered and feared. You see, when a woman sees that clearly, it doesn't just draw admiration, it provokes resistance. But why now? Why this woman? Why had God waited until this exact moment to raise her up? What had happened in the shadows, behind the scenes, that made Deborah's voice the one that pierced through the silence? That's where the mystery deepens. Because before Deborah emerged under the palm tree, before the people began calling her judge, there had been rumors, whispers in the wind, strange signs in the heavens. Some said there had been a vision, an encounter so vivid and terrifying that it left her trembling for days. Others claimed that the prophetess had spent weeks in isolation, fasting in the wilderness, speaking aloud to the night sky as if someone, something, were answering back. Her husband, Lapidoth, never spoke of it publicly, but those closest to him noticed the shift. He had once been the head of the house, the respected elder, but now he deferred to her, quietly, reverently, as though something had happened that none of them could explain. There were others, too, who had their theories. Barak, the military commander from Kadesh, had once been the rising star of the northern tribes. Tall, commanding, trained in strategy, everyone expected him to lead the next rebellion against the Canaanite oppressors. But he had vanished for nearly a year, only to return humbled, haunted, and hesitant. Some said he had failed in a secret campaign. Others believed he had received a message from God, but refused to obey it. The one thing everyone agreed on was that he had changed. He no longer spoke with the same fire. His confidence had cracked. And now, he sat alone, avoiding conflict, refusing every call to action, until Deborah summoned him. Why her voice could move him when no one else could was another puzzle. And then there was Sisera. His name sent shivers down the spine of every Israelite child. The ruthless general of King Jabin's army, his reign of terror had lasted for 20 years. His iron chariots were unmatched, giant beasts of war, wheels spiked with blades, thundering across the plains like storms. Villages were razed, women taken, children enslaved. But what made Sisera truly terrifying wasn't his weapons, it was his unpredictability. One day he would offer mercy, the next he would burn an entire town to the ground without warning. And behind his cruelty, there were deeper rumors still. Unconfirmed sightings, strange sacrifices, foreign priests whispering to him in forgotten tongues. People said he had made dark covenants with gods not their own, that he wore a necklace of bones, that his eyes glowed red in battle. Of course, most dismissed these as fear-fueled myths. But deep down, no one really knew what Sisera was capable of, or what he truly wanted. The land itself seemed to reflect the tension in the air. Crops withered before harvest. Wells dried up overnight. Wolves crept closer to the villages. Even the sky grew stranger. Blood-red sunsets, sudden storms, a suffocating stillness that made mothers clutch their children tightly after dark. Some said it was nature reacting to human corruption. Others believed it was a sign, a warning, that something or someone had been unleashed. And while many cried out to God for deliverance, more than a few turned to other sources for help. Idols carved in secret. Strange rituals held in hidden groves. Even some of the tribal elders were rumored to have made compromises, desperate bargains to protect their people. And that's where the cracks began to show. Because the closer Deborah came to power, the more enemies she seemed to make, not from among the Canaanites, but from within her own people. Jealous leaders questioned her authority. Former judges, men stripped of respect, grumbled behind closed doors. Who is she to speak for God, they muttered. Who appointed her? Some claimed her visions were delusions. Others warned that her boldness would provoke the wrath of the enemy. But beneath their criticisms lay something more poisonous: fear. Fear of losing control. Fear that if she was right, they had all been wrong. And in that fear, alliances began to form. Secret meetings. Hidden agendas. Even Barak, for all his loyalty, was being watched carefully, suspected of conspiring with Deborah to seize power through divine manipulation. But what if it wasn't manipulation? What if Deborah truly had seen something no one else could see? What if her visions were not just religious metaphors, but literal warnings? That's what some of the villagers believed. They spoke of a dream she had shared once in passing, barely above a whisper. A mountain covered in fire. A river of blood. A woman standing alone, arms raised to the sky, while thunder split the earth in half. The details were vague, but the message was clear. A reckoning was coming. And the battle wouldn't just be fought on the field, it would be fought in the hearts of men. Between trust and betrayal. Between obedience and fear. And then there was the song. Only a few had heard it, Late at night, when the campfires burned low and the wind grew still, Deborah would hum it softly, half melody, half prayer. No one knew where it came from. No one dared ask. But the tune lingered, haunting and beautiful, echoing in the minds of those who heard it. Some said it was the song of the angels. Others believed it was a lament for what was coming. One man, an old priest who had once served in Shiloh, claimed it was a war song from a time before the judges, a melody carried down by prophets who had walked with God in the wilderness. He said it only appeared when the heavens were about to speak. And when Deborah sang it, they listened. But not everyone welcomed the sound. A woman named Kenera, known for her sharp tongue and even sharper instincts, had begun stirring unrest in the nearby settlements. A seer in her own right, though of a different path, Kenera accused Deborah of overstepping, of channeling forces that even the prophets dared not touch. There's power, she would say, and then there's possession. No one quite knew what she meant, but people listened, because Kenera had predicted 3 famines and a plague, and each had come true. She was no friend of Sisera, but she didn't trust Deborah either. And her presence in the region only added to the confusion. Was Deborah truly chosen? Or had she stepped into something she didn't fully understand? Was Barak a reluctant hero, or a puppet waiting for the right moment to cut his strings? Was Sisera simply a brutal general, or the vessel for something older and darker? And what about the elders? The priests? The voices in the crowd who smiled in public but whispered in private? The stage was set. The players were moving. But nothing was certain. Except this: a storm was coming. And when it arrived, no one would escape untouched. Would you like me to continue into the next segment where tension escalates into confrontation? It all started to unravel the moment Deborah sent word to Barak. She had waited until the signs were undeniable, the strange alignments in the stars, the sudden migration of birds flying west in mid-season, the old scroll that surfaced mysteriously at the edge of a dried-up well. That scroll, brittle and stained, wasn't just a fragment of scripture. It was a warning, a prophetic vision, almost word for word, of the events that were beginning to unfold. The scroll mentioned a woman of fire and judgment, a man of war with faltering courage, and a nation teetering on the edge of destruction. But before anyone could fully decipher it, it vanished. One day it was safely locked in the clay jar Deborah had hidden beneath the altar near Bethel, and the next morning it was gone. No sign of a break-in, no damage, just absence. Only a faint smear of ash remained where it had once rested, as though someone or something had burned it in complete silence. Deborah didn't panic, but the pressure began to build. She noticed things changing around her. The elders who had once sought her counsel now came less frequently, their eyes shifty, their greetings half-hearted. Even Lapidoth, usually grounded and calm, had grown distant. He said little, but there was something hollow in his voice when he did speak, like he was holding back a truth too heavy to say out loud. Then there was the merchant from Shunem, an old friend who arrived unexpectedly one evening, offering supplies and a carefully worded warning. "Be careful who you trust," he said, without looking her in the eyes. "Not everyone standing beside you wants you to lead. Some prefer the silence." She pressed him for more, but he only shook his head and left before dawn. That same night, someone threw a stone through the side of her tent. No note, just a jagged rock wrapped in blood-stained cloth. And yet, Deborah pressed forward. The vision she had received wasn't something she could ignore. It came to her not as a dream, but like a memory from the future, vivid, consuming, impossible to forget. She had seen a battle, yes, but more than that, she had seen betrayal. Not from Sisera, not from the enemy, but from within her own circle. Someone close to her would make a choice that would shift the balance. Someone trusted, loved. The image of a hand, covered in dust and calluses, reaching for a blade not meant to be drawn, haunted her waking thoughts. And yet, the face attached to that hand was always hidden in shadow. No matter how hard she tried to remember it, that final detail slipped through her mind like smoke. That's when Barak arrived, and things became even more complicated. His face was thinner than she remembered, his armor less polished, his tone measured but guarded. He bowed respectfully, but his eyes were cautious, as if he wasn't sure whether he had come for guidance or confrontation. "Why now?" he asked her privately. "Why this battle? What aren't you telling me?" Deborah wanted to trust him fully, but a hesitation crept in. Something about the way he avoided the palm tree, how his gaze lingered too long on the sealed scroll box beside her bed, made her wonder if his return had been entirely voluntary. Had he come because he believed, or because he had no other choice? Worse still, Barak wasn't alone. He had brought with him a new advisor, a man named Omri from the tribe of Ephraim, tall and lean with a quiet voice and an uncanny ability to disappear into a crowd. Omri claimed to be loyal, eager to serve, and full of praise for Deborah's wisdom. But something in his flattery felt rehearsed, like a man repeating lines learned long ago. He asked too many questions. He wandered the camp at odd hours. And twice, Deborah caught him watching her from a distance, expression unreadable, fingers twitching as if itching to write something down. When she asked Barak about him, he shrugged it off. "He's new. Comes highly recommended." But that didn't explain why Omri carried a blade beneath his robe, one shaped not in the style of the Hebrews, but in the curved pattern used by Canaanite assassins. As tensions grew, Deborah became increasingly isolated. Kenera, the seer woman, had returned and was stirring panic among the lower tribes, claiming she'd had a vision of her own, a blood moon rising over the land, with a woman standing at its center, not victorious, but weeping. She didn't name Deborah directly, but the implication was clear. And her followers were growing. Superstitious farmers. Disillusioned warriors. Even some of the elders had begun to visit her under the cover of night. When Deborah confronted one of them, he stammered something about seeking a second opinion. That same week, the offerings at the altar of Bethel were tampered with. The sacred oil turned rancid. The bread went moldy overnight. Some called it coincidence. Others called it a curse. Still, Deborah held on. She clung to the fragments of clarity that remained, the rhythm of the old song, the whispers of scripture, the fire in her chest that refused to go out. But doubt had begun to creep in. And doubt, she knew, was more dangerous than fear. It made you question your vision, your calling, your very identity. And then, just as she began to think she was imagining it all, the message came. Slipped beneath her tent flap, written in faded ink on coarse parchment, a single line: "She who speaks for God must be silent, or she will not speak again." There was no signature, no trace, only that chilling threat, curled in the morning dew. But the real blow came later that day, when she went to visit the cave of records where the tribal scrolls were stored. She had hoped to find an ancient prophecy she vaguely remembered, one that might confirm the warnings in her vision. But the scroll was missing. And not just missing, it had been removed surgically, the shelves around it untouched, the scrolls beside it still in perfect order. Only that one was gone. And standing in the doorway of the cave, backlit by sunlight, was Omri, smiling faintly, saying nothing. And just like that, Deborah knew the betrayal had already begun. But what she didn't know, what no one yet could have guessed, was that the greatest danger wasn't in the missing scrolls, or the whispers of rivals, or even the growing shadow of Sisera's army. The real danger was much closer, watching, waiting, carrying a name she thought she could trust. And in just a few short nights, everything she believed would be turned upside down. Would you like me to continue into the next section where these tensions explode into direct conflict? While Deborah stared at the parchment threatening her voice, far away in the foothills north of Mount Tabor, someone else received a message, one just as chilling and just as cryptic. Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, had never asked to be part of this unfolding chaos. Her people were nomads, skilled in survival, masters of the in-between spaces. They owed no loyalty to the Israelites, and they had struck uneasy peace with the Canaanites long ago. But Jael had always been different. Quiet, observant, dangerous in the way only those who are underestimated can be. Her tent, pitched just beyond the reach of political affairs, had become a resting point for many who moved through the region. She heard more than most. She noticed what others missed. And when a small child wandered into her camp at sunrise with a bundle wrapped in wool, she knew before she even touched it that something was wrong. Inside the bundle was a stone tablet, small, worn, nearly crumbling under the weight of time. But engraved on its surface, clear and unmistakable, were the same symbols Deborah had once described during her visions. Symbols no one had used for generations. Symbols tied to the old prophecies, the ones forbidden by the temple scribes. And alongside them, etched in a hand that looked recently carved, were the words, "Do not trust the woman beneath the tree." Jael stared at the tablet for a long time, her heartbeat dull and heavy in her chest. She had only met Deborah once, years ago, in passing, but the memory of the encounter had stayed with her. The way Deborah's eyes had looked through her, not at her, like she already knew who Jael was before she said a word. It was not a feeling Jael had liked. And now, someone was trying to turn that moment into a weapon. But who? Who would go to such lengths to pit Deborah against an outsider? Was it simply manipulation, or was there a deeper connection between their fates than either of them had realized? That night, while the camp slept, Jael placed the tablet in a hidden crevice beneath the cooking stones and sat with her thoughts. She recalled strange conversations her husband had had with foreign riders in recent months, men who never gave their names, who always arrived after dark and left before sunrise. Heber had dismissed her concerns, claiming they were traders from Hazu. But Jael remembered the uneasy tension in his body, the way he had stopped looking her in the eyes after those meetings. Now, she wasn't so sure. And what unsettled her most was a scrap of conversation she had overheard late one night, when her husband believed she was asleep. When it happens, keep her inside. She must not interfere. Back in the Israelite encampment, Deborah's suspicions deepened. Omri had become increasingly involved in planning the upcoming march toward Mount Tabor, advising Barak on strategic placements, suggesting troop formations that seemed oddly favorable to certain terrain features, details only someone intimately familiar with the enemy's tactics would know. Deborah quietly ordered a background check through an old friend in Ephraim. 3 days later, the messenger returned pale and trembling, claiming there was no Omri son of Natan in the tribe of Ephraim. The name had been borrowed. Faked. And yet when confronted, Omri didn't deny it. He simply smiled and said, "Sometimes, we are who we need to be to get things done." The next morning, Barak was missing. No note. No warning. His tent undisturbed. His sword still in its place. Only a single strand of red-dyed linen was left tied to the branch of a fig tree near the outskirts of camp, a Canaanite symbol for a captured enemy. But there was no sign of struggle, no tracks leading away. Just silence. The soldiers were divided. Some believed he had defected, others suspected a kidnapping. A few even whispered that Deborah had known this would happen and allowed it for her own purposes. The seeds of doubt had found fertile ground. And still, Deborah could not shake the feeling that none of this was what it seemed. Meanwhile, Jael's unease turned into dread. She returned to the hidden tablet, only to find it gone. The firestones had been moved, carefully reset to hide the disturbance. And a new message had been left in its place, scratched onto the side of her tent flap. "When the stars fall, she will be the knife." It made no sense at first, until she remembered the phrase from the Forbidden Scrolls, the ones that spoke of a woman who would end a great war not with an army, but with a single act, one so shocking that it would change the course of a nation's destiny. Deborah had spoken of those scrolls once, but Jael never imagined they had anything to do with her. Now, the lines between prophecy and reality were beginning to blur. People were choosing sides in battles that hadn't yet begun. Old allies were pulling away. Former enemies were creeping closer. And somewhere in the darkness, a larger hand was moving the pieces on a board that no one fully understood. The threats were no longer just whispers. They were plans. Traps. Destinies written in shadows. And as Deborah prepared to speak before the gathered tribes at the next full moon, her most public appearance yet, a final message arrived. It was carved into the side of a sacrificial altar in the dead of night, written in blood and surrounded by 7 charred stones. It read only, "The traitor has already kissed your hand." But which one? Would you like to continue into the next section where the hidden agendas begin to unravel? Deborah was halfway up the ridge when she saw it, a second plume of smoke, this one darker, rising from beyond the valley near the old sycamore grove, far from any known camps or outposts. That's when the unease in her chest sharpened into dread. Signals from 2 separate locations? No war council had authorized this. And worse, they were too perfectly timed, too deliberately positioned to be coincidence. Her thoughts raced. The false prophecy scroll, Lapidoth's disappearance, the blood-red cloth. What if all of it wasn't just misdirection or betrayal, but part of a broader deception? What if they had all been looking at the wrong enemy this entire time? At that moment, a voice called her name from behind, breathless, hoarse, barely audible over the rustling wind. She turned to see a woman approaching, wrapped in a cloak too fine for a commoner, but not quite noble. Her face was familiar, achingly so, and yet out of place here. Deborah's breath caught in her throat. It was Abigail, the temple scribe who had disappeared months ago after the fire that destroyed 1/3 of the sacred texts. Everyone had believed her dead. Deborah had mourned her. But now, here she was, gaunt and pale, eyes blazing with urgency. She didn't waste time with greetings or explanations. She thrust a tattered scroll into Deborah's hands and whispered words that turned Deborah's blood to ice. "The prophecy you've been following isn't the original. It was rewritten by your council. Not for Canaan, but for control." Deborah blinked, her voice failing her. Abigail pointed to the margins of the scroll, where faint ink beneath the script could still be seen if held at the right angle. She had risked her life to salvage it from the temple ruins. And what it revealed wasn't a call to war. It was a warning against manipulation through holy words, against using prophecy as political strategy. According to this version, the real vision had been suppressed because it declared no judge, no war leader, no tribe would bring victory. It would come instead from an outsider, a foreigner, a woman with no lineage, no title, no prophecy tied to her name. And that's when Deborah's eyes widened, her mind snapping back to the strange contradiction in the early prophecy, the one she had dismissed. A woman delivering Israel not through judgment or battle, but through an unsanctioned act. Jael. It wasn't just a poetic metaphor. It was the original ending. And if that was true, then everything Deborah had done to prepare for war, the alliances, the gathering of troops, the scrolls passed hand to hand, it was all built on a lie planted from within. The council hadn't just manipulated her. They had used the people's faith to script a narrative that kept them in power. And suddenly it clicked. The council had never feared Canaan. They had feared what might happen if the people discovered that salvation didn't need to come through judges or tribes or temples. That real deliverance could come from anyone, even a tent-dwelling woman like Jael. That would unravel everything they had built. Their rule, their status, their sacred authority. And so they rewrote the vision, and then buried the truth. Deborah felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Her entire identity had been rooted in the belief that she was chosen, not just by fate, but by divine will. But now she wasn't sure if the will had ever been heard clearly, or if it had been distorted through the ambitions of others. Her stomach turned as she looked again at Abigail, who now spoke softer, almost mournfully. "You were meant to be a voice, but they made you a weapon." Just then, a horn sounded from below, the first signal of the advancing tribes. The war was beginning. But now Deborah no longer knew if it was a war worth fighting, or a trap that had been decades in the making. Worse, if Jael truly was the foretold deliverer, then where was she now? And had the council already moved to silence her before she could fulfill her role? The story had flipped. Deborah wasn't the hero. She was the decoy. Would you like to continue into the next part, where Deborah must decide whether to stop the war or let it unfold, knowing either choice could destroy everything she's built? Deborah descended the ridge with her thoughts astorm, her heart pounding louder than the war drums that had begun echoing across the valley floor. Every footfall felt heavier now, like she was dragging the weight of something no one else could see, a truth so devastating that even her bones recoiled from it. She held the tattered scroll Abigail had given her tightly against her chest, as though shielding it might slow the unraveling of everything she believed in. But the words on that parchment had already taken root in her. Every step toward the camp felt like a betrayal, to the people, to the prophets, and most of all, to herself. The war horns were sounding because of her. The people were ready to die because of her. But what if she had only ever been a chapter in someone else's narrative? A name to legitimize a lie? As she neared the outer edge of the encampment, she spotted a familiar figure at the edge of the firelight. Lapidoth, hunched over a basin, washing dust from his hands with slow, deliberate motions. For a fleeting second, she wished she could unknow everything Malkon and Abigail had told her. Wished she could believe her husband's hands were clean, that the shadow in his eyes was just fatigue and not guilt. But there was no escaping it now. The truth had a gravity of its own, and it pulled her toward him whether she was ready or not. He didn't flinch as she approached. He didn't look surprised. He just straightened, dried his hands on a cloth, and met her eyes with a kind of practiced calm that felt more like armor than honesty. Deborah didn't raise her voice. She simply asked him if he remembered the fig leaf clasp, the one that had been found in her tent. He hesitated only a moment before nodding. Yes, he said he remembered. She asked why he hadn't said anything. And this time, his answer came slower, heavier, because he didn't know whose side he was supposed to be on anymore. That's when something broke inside her, not from anger, but from heartbreak. He hadn't denied it. He hadn't tried to twist it. He just stood there, quietly confirming everything she had feared. And then, with the tension between them stretched like a wire, he gave her a choice: walk into the council meeting together and read the sanctioned prophecy aloud, the one that would secure tribal unity and move the people forward into battle, or expose the truth and risk everything. The war effort would collapse, tribal leaders would lose faith, and their already fragile unity would shatter into bitter suspicion. People would say she had gone mad, been misled by a ghost. Worse, if she accused the council of fabricating the prophecy, she would be discrediting the very system she had helped build. The spiritual authority of the judges would be undone, and no one, not even Jael, if she did exist, would be able to fill the void fast enough to stop the chaos that would follow. He told her to think carefully, not just about what was right, but what was necessary. Then he stepped aside, leaving her to decide alone. But she wasn't alone. As the sky began to burn with morning light, Barak returned. He was gaunt, bruised, and riding a horse that looked half dead from exhaustion. But he was alive, and not in chains. He had escaped barely. And his return didn't bring clarity. It brought more questions. He claimed he had been taken not by Canaanites, but by rogue elements within the tribes. Men acting under orders from someone who claimed to be protecting the future of Israel by removing unpredictable elements from the plan. Barak was one of those elements. But the most chilling part of his story was that he'd overheard names during his captivity, names of tribal elders and judges she had known for years. Men and women who had stood beside her, sworn loyalty to the vision, all the while planning something else in secret. Not for peace. Not even for victory. But for permanence. Power preserved through prophecy, managed like currency, distributed only to those who stayed inside the circle. Deborah listened, numb with the weight of it all. Her allies weren't just compromised. They were architects of an illusion. And now, with Barak's return, she realized her impossible choice had become even more tangled. If she acted, she might save truth but destroy unity. If she stayed silent, she could preserve order but feed the lie. And somewhere out there, if the scrolls were right, Jael still waited. The woman no one had expected. The one no one could control. A wild card in a rigged game. The war was no longer against the Canaanites. The real war was within her camp. Within her soul. She was staring at a battlefield that stretched not across the valley, but into the hearts of her people. And there was no clear way forward. Just then, a horn sounded again. Not from a valley. Not from the council tent, but from the far northern edge, where no signal was expected. It was the sound of something approaching. And for the first time, Deborah didn't know whether it was a warning or an answer. Would you like the next part to show what happens when Deborah walks into the council tent, carrying the truth like a blade? The sound of that horn changed everything. It wasn't a battle cry. It wasn't a call to gather. It was different, lower, longer, almost mournful. Deborah knew that sound, but she hadn't heard it since the earliest days of her judgment, when old prophets still wandered the ridges whispering their dreams into the soil. It was a sound reserved for one thing only, a breach in the covenant. Someone had broken faith. Someone high up. She moved fast, blood pulsing in her ears, her breath quick and shallow. The camp was stirring now, commanders rousing from their tents, young sentries looking to their captains for orders. Barak was already at her side, walking with a limp but ready for battle if it came. But this wasn't war yet. It was something worse. War was clean compared to this. This was rot, spreading from inside the tree. At the edge of the northern perimeter, Deborah found the source of the horn. A lone rider, dusty and trembling, collapsed from his horse before he could even speak. Deborah crouched to help him, brushing hair from his face, and froze. It was Ruel, one of her oldest council scribes. He had vanished months ago, presumed dead in a raid. But now he was here, whispering with a cracked voice and eyes like shattered glass. "It's bigger than Hazer," he rasped. "It's not just Canaan. It's Kadesh. It's within the Levites. The scrolls, they've been rewritten, replicated. Not all of them are yours." For a moment she couldn't breathe. The sacred scrolls that recorded her judgments, her visions, scrolls believed to be preserved under lock and prayer, had been tampered with, copied, altered, and distributed to tribes selectively. Different versions of prophecy, different calls to action. Some calling for unity, others for aggression. A few even speaking of Deborah's death as part of divine will. All fake, all weaponized. Barak helped Ruel to his feet, but the scribe could barely stand. He looked straight at Deborah, eyes wide with something between awe and terror. "They don't want to kill you," he whispered. "They want you to lead into ruin." That's when it hit her. This was never about silencing her. It was about steering her. From the very beginning, they had propped her up, let her grow into legend, so that when she spoke, the people would move without question. She had become the lever, and someone else was pulling the fulcrum from behind the curtain. She turned on her heel and stormed toward the council tent, the guards stepping back instinctively at the fire in her eyes. Inside, the council had already assembled, dressed in formal robes, their expressions arranged in calm readiness. But there was a chill in the room, something darker lurking just beneath their poised surfaces. Lapidoth was there, seated at her left, as always. But now, she noticed the way his hands rested too still on the table, like a man holding down a secret. She didn't waste time. Deborah threw the scroll pouch onto the center of the table. "How many copies?" she demanded. No one spoke. She looked from face to face, daring one of them to meet her gaze. "How many versions of the truth have you written?" Finally, Eleazar, one of the oldest and most revered council members, leaned forward. His voice was soft, patronizing even. "It was never about truth, Deborah. It was about preservation. Unity. You gave the people faith, but faith needs guidance, structure, control." She felt Barak tense beside her, fists clenched. Deborah stepped closer to Eleazar, her voice trembling with fury. "You altered prophecy to control people. To protect them," he said, still calm. "You gave them hope. We gave them direction. By lying," she spat. "By simplifying," he said, like it was an answer. "The people need a story they can follow. They don't need to know every shadow." And then, from across the room, another voice cut in, a voice she had never expected to betray her. "Abigail." Deborah turned, disbelief writhing in her chest as the girl stepped forward, no longer the frightened novice, but composed, measured. "I gave you the scroll, Deborah," she said quietly, "because I wanted you to know what they did. But not so you could burn it all down. There has to be something left standing. If you go public, everything collapses. The tribes fall apart. We become prey. Deborah stared at her, wounded more deeply than if someone had struck her with a blade. Abigail hadn't betrayed her with silence. She had betrayed her with strategy. This wasn't about exposing the truth. It was about managing it, protecting the structure while letting Deborah believe she still held the reins. And then, just as the tension hit its peak, a voice from the tent flap shattered the illusion completely. "They're already coming." Everyone turned. Malcolm stood there, dirt-streaked and out of breath. The Eastern scouts returned. Hazer's forces aren't just massing at the border. They've moved, quietly, south, toward the Valley of Elah. Silence fell. The Valley of Elah wasn't just a battlefield. It was the sacred burial ground of the judges, the place of covenant. A move on Elah was more than a military strike. It was symbolic. It meant Jabin knew the weakness. He knew the fracture inside Israel's leadership, and he was about to drive a sword through it. Deborah looked at every face in the tent. Allies, betrayers, strategists, cowards, and maybe still, somewhere among them, someone who could be trusted. She didn't know anymore, but she did know this. Whatever choice she made now, it would shape not just the outcome of the war, but the soul of her people. And she had only one night to decide. Would you like the next part to begin the climax, where Deborah must take action under immense pressure and lead in a way no prophecy could predict? The firelight flickered against the carved wooden walls of the judgment tent, casting long shadows that seemed to breathe with the tension inside. Outside, the Valley of Elah was a heartbeat away from eruption. Soldiers stood at the ready, horses bridled in silence, prayers whispered into the wind. But inside, within the sacred space where Israel's destiny had been written for generations, Deborah stood alone now. The council had scattered. Trust was shattered. And the war, real war, was coming, not just from Hazer's advancing lines, but from within her own house of faith. The scrolls lay sprawled across the table, authentic and false side by side, like two versions of a dream at war with one another. And standing at the far end of the tent, beneath the very palm tree where Deborah had once heard the voice of God as a girl, stood Lapidoth. He didn't try to explain himself. He didn't deny it. There was no point. She could see it all now, his hesitation over the years, the way he had always supported her in public, but rarely in private. How he had celebrated her victories while quietly collecting every fear, every hesitation she'd ever whispered in exhaustion. He had loved her. She believed that once. But love without courage could become something cruel when tested. And he had been tested. By the Canaanites. By the council. By his own pride. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said quietly, not stepping closer. "I never thought it would be you who bled for it." Deborah stared at him, feeling the burn rise in her throat. "You watched them use me," she said, voice breaking at the edges. "You watched them build a false altar out of my faith, and you helped. You were the one person I thought I could trust. And you sold that trust to keep me safe in a cage." "I didn't want to lose you," he said, his voice trembling. "But you were never mine to keep. You were becoming something untouchable. I just wanted to protect the woman, not the myth." She walked toward him slowly, deliberately, her boots dragging across the dusty rug as the weight of every prophecy, every lie, every manipulated dream pressed down on her shoulders. "And what did you think would happen, Lapidoth? That I'd just smile and wave the flag while they rewrote heaven? That I'd go quiet while the voice of God was twisted into a weapon?" He didn't answer. He just lowered his eyes. And that's when she saw it. Beneath the folds of his robe, something caught the candlelight. A silver chain. Not from him. From someone else. A gift, perhaps. But it bore the crest of Hazer. Jabin's seal. Not from years ago. New. Fresh. The betrayal hadn't ended. It had evolved. "You're still working with them," she whispered, her voice like flint against stone. Lapidoth looked up, and for a flicker of a moment, something dark passed over his face. Regret. Or maybe recognition. "They said they'd spare the children," he muttered. "If I help turn you at the council. Just this once." The tent went deathly silent. Outside, the first horns of Hazor's march began to howl through the hills. Deborah stepped back, every nerve in her body screaming. She wanted to collapse. She wanted to scream, to ask why, to demand an answer from the skies. But there was no time. The battle was here. And the voice that had once whispered to her under this very tree returned, not as thunder, but as clarity. She moved to the chest behind her, where only she had the key. Inside was the last unaltered scroll, the true prophecy she had once dismissed as too chaotic, too defiant of tradition. She unrolled it quickly, her eyes scanning the ink by firelight. It spoke not of lines drawn by men, not of councils or kings, but of a woman unnamed, who would drive the final stake. Not in war, not in battle, but in private, in a tent, with her own hand.
She knew what it meant. Jail.
And then it clicked. The prophecy had never been about Deborah leading a charge. It was about clearing a path. The true deliverance wouldn't come from her army. It would come from an outsider, unseen by the scribes, unwritten in their scrolls. A woman who lived outside the structure of tribes and councils. A woman with a tent peg and the nerve to use it. She turned to Barak, who had entered behind her silently, sword drawn but uncertain. "Ride to Jael's camp," she ordered, breath fast.
"Now.
Tell her the man she's been waiting for is coming." Barak didn't question. He disappeared into the night. And just as Deborah turned back to Lapidoth, ready to say whatever final words remained between them, the ground shuddered. A blast of sound. Then another. Hazor's siege had begun. Lapidoth moved to leave, but Deborah stepped in his way. "No more lies," she said. "No more safety. Go with the people. Stand where they can see you. Let them judge you for what you did." He opened his mouth to protest, but then stopped. Perhaps for the first time, he saw her not as the woman he had tried to protect, but as the judge of Israel. The one voice no false prophecy could drown. And as he left the tent, the final twist revealed itself. Malchon was waiting just outside, not alone, but with Abigail. And in her hand was the seal of Hazor. She wasn't working to preserve the council. She had been feeding both sides, misinformation to Deborah, strategies to Hazor. A double agent, playing the long game. She had once believed Deborah could be guided into war. But when that failed, she had prepared a backup plan. Jael wasn't just an outsider. She was a contingency, a killer. And Abigail had ensured Sisera's path led straight into her tent. Deborah froze in the doorway, watching Abigail mount her horse and ride. Not away, but toward Hazor's ranks. She had just realized one last terrifying truth. This war was never meant to be won. It was meant to be endured, burned into history. And Abigail, sweet, quiet, brilliant Abigail, had orchestrated it all. Would you like the final resolution scene where the truth comes to light and Deborah must make her final judgment, at great personal cost? By the time the dust settled over the valley of Elah, the ground was littered with the footprints of those who had believed they were walking toward glory, but instead had stumbled headfirst into a reckoning. The battle, though brutal, was not the decisive war many had expected. It was a distraction, a storm staged on the wrong horizon. Sisera never made it to the heart of Israel's command, never reached the sanctuary of his own war tent. Instead, he fled the battlefield in chaos, seeking shelter, as prophesied, in the humble encampment of Jael, the woman the scrolls had barely named, the one no council had anticipated. Deborah heard the report 2 nights later, delivered by Barak himself, who rode with tears still drying on his dust-streaked face. He described the moment Jael stepped from her tent, blood on her hands and calm in her voice, declaring that Israel's enemy lay dead inside, not slain in combat, but struck down in sleep, a tent peg driven through the skull with the precision of one who knew there was no other way. The war, as it turned out, had never truly been about swords or prophecy. It had been about manipulation, control, the illusion of sacred direction used to pull the strings of fear. And Deborah, once the unwitting face of that deception, had become its breaker. The moment she exposed the council's duplicity, the structure they had so carefully built began to collapse. Elders resigned or vanished. Scrolls were burned, not out of anger, but out of shame. Abigail, whose betrayal had cut the deepest, was never captured. Some believed she fled east, beyond the Jordan, to serve new masters. Others claimed she still walked among them in disguise, ensuring that the old systems would never rebuild themselves unchecked. No one knew for certain, but her final move, engineering both chaos and salvation, remained etched in the hearts of those who survived. As for Lapidoth, he never returned to Deborah's tent. After the battle, he chose exile, disappearing into the southern deserts where no tribe held sway. Deborah allowed it. Not out of mercy, but out of weariness. Some betrayals were too personal to judge with clean hands. Let the silence of the wilderness weigh on him where her words no longer could. The council dissolved slowly, replaced not by another circle of power, but by a quieter, less centralized gathering of voices, people who knew now the cost of blind obedience. The era of judges had not ended, but it had cracked open, leaving space for something new to grow. And Deborah? She returned to the palm tree. Not because it made her feel powerful, but because it reminded her of when she was first called, not by men, not by titles or symbols, but by something deeper, the voice that spoke beneath the surface of the world. She still sat there some mornings listening not for command, but for clarity. She knew now that prophecy was a fragile thing, easily twisted, easily exploited, but still worth holding on to if you remembered its purpose was to reveal, not control. She no longer judged daily disputes. She no longer marched at the front of armies. Instead, she became a keeper of memory, of truth, of warning. But even as peace returned to the land, even as songs were sung of Jael's hand and Deborah's voice, there was one story Deborah never told. A detail she kept close, buried beneath the surface of all the others. The morning after Sisera's death, as she read the final line of the original prophecy one last time, she noticed a small marking in the scroll's margin, too faint to be visible at first glance. It was not a word, not a phrase, but a symbol, a flame enclosed in a circle. It was the same mark that had once appeared in the private seals of the ancient priests, the original prophets who had walked with God in the earliest days of the wilderness. It meant something simple, something terrifying.
This was not the end.
The prophecy hadn't predicted a singular victory. It had predicted a cycle, a rise, a fall, and another rise, of systems, of saviors, of manipulators cloaked in holiness. What happened in Elah would happen again, someday. Maybe not with swords, maybe not with scrolls. But the battle between truth and control, between divine voice and human ambition, was not finished. And so Deborah sat beneath the tree, morning after morning, not as a judge, not as a warrior, not even as a prophet, but as a witness. Because someone would need to remember the real story when the next one began. And if you've listened this far, maybe that someone is you.